I think, what would be our last question on sustainable rural communities.
Thank you. Charles Dennis-Smith from Antarctica and the Environmental Pillar. So our question is about rural towns and sustainable communities, And by the way, I come from a rural community. Rural towns across Ireland are dying. Poor planning for urban centres, poor planning generally, poor public transport links, one-off housing, the closing of essential services, and the lack of employment opportunities are contributing to this decline. How will you ensure that the life is kept in our communities across the country in a way that is socially, economically, and environmentally sustainable?
Thank you. George, we'll start with you again.
I think one of the keys to making sustainable rural communities relates to the whole provision of broadband, and the sooner broadband is rolled out right across the country, the easier it will be for some people to live in rural communities. And another thing that I would like to emphasise is that the more we can move away from one-off housing and try and cluster housing in towns and villages, the better. I think for some rural towns and villages to thrive, they will need to take action in their own hands. This is possible in some parts of the country, but not in others. For example, in relation to tourism, if a town or village has good potential tourist facilities in the neighbourhood, whether that be fishing in lakes or rivers or scenery or whatever, I think that it's possible to improve the situation there. And I think it's also important, obviously, to support small farmers to keep their farms viable. But I mean, I think more that rural development can be around towns and villages, the more that will help to sustain those villages. But I mean, I think it's also worth saying that some towns are doing much better than others, and part of the reason for that is because of people's use of their powers. I mean, one area of the country that I know well is North Meath, and the town of Kells is economically on its knees compared to the town of Navan, and that's simply because people locally go to Navan rather than Kells to do their shopping. So, I mean, there are certain choices that people need to make in terms of their own immediate local environment. But it definitely would help the more things are clustered around towns and villages.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And indeed, I think there should be good news for rural areas, particularly with the investment and the new broadband programme now that states that 85% and nearly everybody in the country will have broadband with the new programme that the government are rolling out. And I know the Minister has stated that, and for it to come on stream. And because by having the broadband, you can work, as you know, from anywhere, and it is attractive to live in the country, health-wise and everything else. Now, the thing about creating jobs, actually, when saying, all of the jobs are going to Dublin and the urban area, that is not factually correct. In the last year, over 55% of the jobs that were created outside Dublin and the Mid-East region. So jobs are being created, not obviously everywhere, but more jobs now are being created outside Dublin last year than inside Dublin. So that is a change, and that is a recognition that we do have to support rural communities, and they are getting that with the job, the action plan for jobs. And again, there is a full section there on how Fine Gael are supporting with the action plan for jobs with that. I must say, in planning, particularly for the rural community were let down indeed. But I know the Minister for the Environment, Minister Jen O'Sullivan, there in her short time in the planning department, she invoked section 31 of the Planning Act for what you would call bad planning with local authorities. She invoked it 10 times in her short 2 years, I think it was. And in the previous 10 years, it was only invoked, I think, 8 times. So that is a change, if you like, to say, well, you obey the laws that are drawn up nationally at local level. And I know you have to be strong and you have to do it, but that is the way it is. And the Minister has sent out a circular, the Minister for the Environment, to all local authorities now on that vein. And it is sustainable rural planning again. And I know more on cluster development, like you have right around the continent, but not in Ireland. This one-off housing bungalow, this situation that we have, that destroyed rural communities. But it is changing. But obviously we have to be realistic as well in dwelling. As I say, there is a huge, I think, opportunity for rural communities, particularly if you go back to the food production, or local food production, to encourage that. And that is one of the initiatives as well that we are going to try and work on further for sustainable food production. And that feeds into job creation then in the country as well, because food miles is one of the hugest thing for carbon in everywhere globally. And again, when we look at our health and air pollution, if you live in the country and people you introduced the subject there, you have chosen to live in the country, but definitely for the EU Clean Air Package as well, for the 5 main air pollutants, we will have to reduce it even further, the pollution. But in the country, for that, with health, it's going to be a saving for the economy, because it has been costed to society from air pollution, as estimated for health-wise, 330 to 940 billion. So that's what, no, but I'm just saying, living in the country, we can say everybody wants to live in Dublin. Why does everybody have to live in Dublin now? They don't have to. We're talking about transport. We need a rural transport links to facilitate that. We have initiatives in our manifesto as well on rural transport, to try with the LEADER programme to develop rural transport links to make living in the country more attractive. Not everybody has to live in Dublin. With broadband coming, there will be more jobs and it will be more sustainable.
Thank you. Sorry, Coach, it's not personal.
Not at all. Yeah, well, Sinn Féin has produced a document, a policy document called a New Deal for the West, which is to try and address sustainable rural communities, because rural communities have been decimated, particularly under the last number of years with the austerity, and you have GAA teams not even being able to field a team now because the villages have lost all of their young. So what our New Deal for the West is calling for, developing a new enterprise spatial strategy to orient infrastructure and development, but also to develop a regional cluster policy targeting specific sectors. So for example, a cluster sector of renewable energy. So to try and create the development on the West Coast, develop a green economy plan for the West. But we also need to look at the policies that have been implemented over the last few years. The closing down of post offices, the closing down of guard stations, the type of planning that we've had. So we have to review all of that. But one of the other things that we're looking at is to provide financial stimulus for social enterprises and cooperatives, because they are rooted in their communities. They're not like foreign direct investment that can just up sticks and leave. We know, like the likes of microbreweries, I visited one in Monaghan recently, and they're employing locally, so we need to help this sector. I recently brought a delegation to Brussels to take part in what's called the social solidarity economy, because it is a huge employer across Europe, and in Ireland we just don't get it. We don't get that social enterprise cooperative model and how important it is. And it's not just this government, it's previous governments. They seem to see it as a cottage industry, and it's not. It is a real employer, and we need to invest in it. We need to have ethical banking that finances these projects and give them the legal framework as well to protect it. And that's one way of creating employment in the world. We also, in this document, call for a pilot rural resettlement scheme, and where you would give a financial package to families to relocate. And so we would be calling for that. And also we're looking at in Europe a derogation to the habitual residency to encourage people that would come into Ireland to move to the rural communities rather than into urban communities.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, in broad terms, the depopulation of rural Ireland and the decline of towns, small towns, the economic kind of small towns is to a very large extent a product of the sort of corporate neoliberal for-profit economic model, which has inbuilt centrifugal.
Why does it become more urbanised, you know?
Yeah, and we need to repopulate the rural areas, in my opinion. There's too much of a centrifugal tendency, and it's because of the nature of the market. That's what it does. It centralizes things. So we need to go in the opposite way to the way the market is pushing us, and this is manifest at all sorts of levels. Stop closing small local hospitals. Stop closing and indeed reopen the small post offices. The state, again, has to provide the infrastructure in this regard. Oppose TTIP, very importantly. TTIP is going to destroy what's left of, if you like, small and medium enterprise, particularly in the rural areas. We also need a progressive rates policy. I mean, one of the things that's killing just small business generally is the growth of the big retail chains, driving small retail out of business. A progressive rates policy, which you have in countries like France and Scotland, would give lower rates for small business because it's based not just on square meterage, but it's based on turnover, right, and profitability. So your bank or your Aldi or your Lidl or your Tesco would pay far higher rates than your butcher, your baker, your candlestick maker, and that is the policy that is pursued in places like France. That's why village life, if you like, is still. It's under pressure, but there's a more directed, focused effort to try and retain it. And in Scotland, actually, they brought in the progressive rate system, and 60% of small and medium enterprise benefited, but it meant the big guys paid more. So I think that would be another important part of revitalising small towns and rural areas.
Charles, to answer your question, could I suggest you talk to Garrett Fitzgibbon, our candidate in Tipperary, who has done as a community worker an amazing job with the community of Drumban in bringing people back to the hurling team by driving energy efficiency as one of the community projects that's turned that whole community around. Can I suggest you go and talk to Fergal Smith, our candidate in Clare, who's actually digging and developing a community support agriculture scheme that is a real project and is fighting there to keep an Aldi out of his local Ennis-Diamond town and has a real clear idea of what that future of food could be. Can I suggest you talk to Grace O'Sullivan, our candidate in Waterford, who's done more than anyone else to show how tourism and connecting to nature can work, not just for overseas visitors, but for our own people to get appreciation of nature. Can I suggest you talk to Seamus McMenamin, our candidate in Westmeath, who's working as a community doctor and has a better idea than anyone else how we could develop a community local health system? Can I suggest you listen to Mankin McGann on a vision for how the Midlands of this country could be the centre of a new green renaissance where we actually create jobs and create vibrancy? We have them all over the country. Every single one of our candidates is doing in real life what you're seeking to achieve in your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia, and thank you for the question as well. I suppose I would have to say that we're a party that has absolutely no TDs in Dublin, so I think we have the rural community well in our sights. So all of the 19 Fianna Fáil TDs would probably give a much better response to your question than I'll do, but let me just tell you that we have in our manifesto a very comprehensive policy proposals from all of the TDs around the areas that will and issues that will make our rural communities not just survive but thrive and grow. Yeah, I'm going to. To be fair, I was meant to leave at 6:30, and I stayed deliberately because I want to. Okay. So, in terms of making it possible for people to live in rural communities, we have a proposal around shared sites, so where people would be able to actually live in the local area, but they'd be shared sites and people could access services and build houses in clusters as opposed to the individual one-off houses. We also have proposals around reforming the whole commercial rates in town centres supporting employment in the rural community, not just in terms of supporting our farmers in the agricultural community, in transitioning to environmentally friendly agricultural practices, but also the local employment offices and supporting small enterprise and small businesses and employers in our rural communities. Specifically, I suppose around that, the state has a role to play in terms of post offices, in terms of the Garda stations, in terms of small schools, and we've got very specific proposals around sustaining all of them. The post offices, it's not just about the infrastructure of post offices, it's actually about the state providing the post offices with business to sustain the post offices, and that's about the government's payments plan. And we are very strong on that, and we have supported the retention and saving of all of the local post offices and the saving of small schools. For businesses, I work in the technology sector, and I know very well how you can run a business, a European and international, a global business, from any corner in Ireland if you do have access to the technology and to broadband infrastructure. So we're absolutely committed to that. In terms of public transportation, that's essential as well, and we're committed to that. And I just want to check that I didn't miss anything else out that they wanted me. And yeah, finally, and this is, I think, very important, town councils were abolished. Now, it wasn't the only travesty in the supposed putting people first document and policy, but it was a big one in terms of removal of local democracy. I'm not in favour of more politicians, but I am in favour, and we as a party are committed to empowering communities to have more say in how their communities are run. And so we will restore local town councils, and we will create new community councils to ensure that rural communities and local communities do have a strong say in how their communities are run, and 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 how their communities are run.